The shrill, insistent ring of my secure line cut through the muted hum of my lab, an unwelcome intrusion into the quiet precision of my morning's work. I glanced at the caller ID, Trauma Center Urgent. My brow furrowed. They rarely called directly unless a case was already a puzzle, something beyond the usual street-level chaos. Dean here, I answered, my voice steady despite the sudden shift in my focus. Pathologist, we have a code black, unexplained death. Here on campus, the medical examiner's assistant rattled off, her tone tight with stress. Male, unknown identity, found unresponsive near the South Wing's staff entrance. No obvious trauma, no medical history we can access. The hospital administration is already breathing down our necks. They want answers fast. On campus, I repeated, a note of skepticism creeping into my voice. Deaths within the hospital grounds, especially unexplained ones, always carried an extra layer of scrutiny, a distinct pressure that came from navigating both medical and legal systems. I'm on my way. I shed my lab coat, the familiar weight of it replaced by the lighter, more agile feel of my street clothes. My bag, always packed with essentials for an unexpected scene or a rushed autopsy, was already slung over my shoulder. The drive to the trauma center was short but felt longer, the city traffic a blur of impatience. I mentally reviewed the limited information. Unexplained death, seemingly healthy individual found on hospital grounds. It was a blank slate, but one already smudged with institutional anxiety. The trauma center was a maelstrom of activity, even for a Tuesday morning. Ambulances shrieked their arrival, their sirens echoing off the glass and steel facade. Gurneys clattered down hallways, pushed by harried nurses and doctors whose faces were grim masks of concentration. The air thrummed with the controlled chaos of life and death unfolding simultaneously. I navigated the labyrinthine corridors, a stranger in a familiar medical landscape. The smell of antiseptic, coffee, and something vaguely metallic, blood, probably permeated everything. My usual domain was the quiet, sterile sanctity of the autopsy suite, a place of post-mortem reflection. This, however, was a place of frantic, immediate intervention. The contrast was stark, and the tension in the atmosphere was palpable, a live current humming just beneath the surface. I nodded to a passing resident who offered a curt, distracted greeting, my gaze sweeping over the hurried faces. Everyone here was fighting against time, against disease, against injury. And then there was my fight, against the unknown, against the silence of death. The weight of expectation, both from the medical community and the legal system, settled squarely on my shoulders. A death like this, within the very walls dedicated to preserving life, was an anomaly that demanded swift, accurate resolution. Finally, I reached the quieter, colder section of the hospital, an almost forgotten wing where the urgency of the living gave way to the stillness of the recently deceased. A uniformed officer stood guard outside a heavy, insulated door, his expression stoic. He merely nodded, recognizing my credentials. I pushed through the door, the heavy seal hissing as it broke. The ambient sounds of the bustling hospital faded, replaced by the low, constant thrum of refrigeration units. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a harsh, unforgiving glow on the polished steel surfaces and a single gurney in the center of the room. On the gurney lay the deceased. A white sheet covered him from the chest down, but his upper torso and head were exposed. There were no visible signs of struggle, no contusions, no lacerations, nothing to suggest a violent end. His eyes were closed, his face placid, almost serene. He looked like he could be sleeping. John Doe, the medical examiner's assistant said, stepping forward. Her face was tight, reflecting the pressure he was under. Found by a janitorial supervisor this morning. No ID, no wallet, no phone. He wasn't a patient, no records in the system, no visitor pass logged. I circled the gurney, my gaze sweeping over the man's body with a practiced eye. My initial assessment confirmed what I'd been told. No obvious external cause of death. He was well built, appearing to be in good physical condition. His hands, resting at his sides, were clean, the nails trimmed. No defensive wounds, no needle marks, no telltale signs of a collapse from a sudden, acute illness like a massive heart attack that often left a victim clutching their chest. He just fell over, I murmured, half to myself, half to the assistant. The scenario felt wrong. A seemingly healthy man collapsing without a sound, without a struggle, in a public area of a major hospital, yet completely unnoticed until morning. It defied the usual patterns of sudden death. People didn't just quietly cease to exist in such a high-traffic environment without some precursor, some visible sign. I leaned closer, inspecting the man's neck, then his ears, checking for petechiae, a subtle sign of asphyxia, nothing. I ran a gloved hand lightly over his exposed arm, feeling the nascent rigidity of rigor mortis. The skin was cool but not excessively so, indicating he hadn't been dead for an extended period, perhaps a few hours. "No witnesses?" I asked, straightening up. The assistant shook her head. "None that have come forward. Security cameras in that hallway were apparently malfunctioning last night, according to hospital IT. Convenient, isn't it?" Her voice was laced with an edge of suspicion. I felt a familiar prickle of unease. "Malfunctioning cameras in a hospital," I repeated, my gaze returning to the placid face of the deceased. This was more than just an unexplained death. This was a death shrouded in peculiar circumstances, a silent, almost invisible demise within a fortress of healing. My meticulous nature bristled. The absence of a clear narrative, the lack of any obvious physical explanation, combined with the convenient technical failure, all converged into a single, unsettling conclusion. This wasn't going to be a simple case. The man on the gurney, seemingly healthy and whole, held a secret, and it was my job to peel back the layers until it was revealed. The tension in the quiet room coiled tighter. I had a feeling this was just the beginning. I circled the gurney, my gaze sweeping over the man's body with a practiced eye. No defensive wounds, no obvious signs of struggle or injury. The scene, or lack thereof, already bothered me. Healthy people don't simply drop dead without a reason, and it was my job to find it. I pulled on a fresh pair of nitrile gloves, the faint scent of latex momentarily cutting through the sterile chill of the trauma center cold room awaiting examination. My eyes traced the man's left arm, then his right. No track marks, no unusual bruising. His skin, however, held a peculiar cast. Not cyanotic, not jaundiced, but a subtle, almost imperceptible dusky pallor, as if the life had been drained out of him not suddenly, but slowly, meticulously. It wasn't the typical post-mortem lividity, which was already beginning to settle on his dependent surfaces, a deep purplish red. This was different, a faint, underlying grayish tone that seemed to permeate the superficial layers. I leaned closer, my penlight illuminating the man's face. His eyes were closed, peaceful, almost serene. No petechiae on the conjunctiva, no signs of blunt force trauma to the head. His lips were slightly parted, revealing clean, well-maintained teeth. I ran a gloved finger lightly over his neck, checking for any telltale signs of strangulation, no ligature marks, no subtle indentations. But as my fingers brushed just beneath his left earlobe, I felt something. A microscopic irregularity, barely perceptible to the touch. I angled my penlight, bringing the beam to bear. There it was. A pinprick almost invisible without magnification, perfectly circular, no larger than the tip of a sewing needle. It was surrounded by a minuscule, barely visible halo of erythema, so faint it could easily be dismissed as a minor skin imperfection or an old follicle. But the consistency, the sheer precision of it, screamed otherwise. My brow furrowed. This wasn't a mosquito bite. This wasn't accidental. "Anything, Dr. Dean?" A voice cut through the quiet hum of the cold room. I straightened, turning to see the hospital administrator, a woman in a crisp white lab coat standing just inside the doorway. Her expression was polite, almost deferential, but her eyes held an unmistakable urgency. Beside her stood a senior emergency physician, his arms crossed, a look of weary impatience on his face. "Just beginning the external," I replied, my voice even. I didn't elaborate on the pinprick, not yet. "Right," the administrator said, stepping further in, her gaze sweeping over the body with a clinical detachment that felt a little too practiced. "We're just hoping to get this cleared quickly. Family is already asking questions, and well, you know how these things go. A sudden death in a hospital setting, no obvious cause." It raises eyebrows. "Especially when the patient wasn't actually a patient," the emergency physician added. His tone clipped. "He was found in a staff lounge, healthy as a horse apparently. No history of cardiac issues, no drug use, nothing, just collapsed. We've already run a preliminary toxicology screen from the ER blood draw," the administrator continued, her voice softening slightly. "Negative for common illicit substances. His vitals, before he coded, were within normal limits, though slightly elevated, consistent with someone who'd just walked in from a stressful environment. We're thinking an acute cardiac event. Aneurysm, perhaps, or an undetected arrhythmia." I nodded slowly, letting their suggestions hang in the air. "All possibilities," I conceded, my eyes drifting back to the man on the gurney. "But my job is to rule them out or in systematically." The emergency physician sighed, running a hand through his already disheveled hair. "Of course, just the quicker we can get this wrapped up, the better for everyone. Less disruption to operations, less panic among staff." His gaze met mine, a clear plea for expediency. I understood the pressure they were under. A sudden, unexplained death within the hospital walls was a PR nightmare, a potential liability, and a disruption to the tightly choreographed chaos of a trauma center. They wanted a simple explanation, a clean bill of health, or rather, a clean bill of death that wouldn't raise further questions. A natural cause, quick, undisputed. But that pinprick, almost invisible, was a discordant note in their symphony of convenience, and that subtle, unnatural pallor. They knew I wouldn't be rushed. I returned my focus to the body, pulling back the sheet that covered his torso. His chest was broad, muscular. I palpated his ribs, checking for fractures, then moved my hands over his abdomen. Nothing immediately obvious. No external signs of trauma, no distension. The skin here, too, held that faint, grayish undertone, more pronounced now that I was looking for it. It was like a ghost of a bruise, a shadow of an internal event that hadn't quite broken the surface. I moved to his legs, examining them methodically. No deep vein thrombosis, no obvious edema. But as I reached his right ankle, near the malleolus, I found another mark. This one was even fainter than the one on his neck. A tiny linear abrasion, perhaps a millimeter in length, almost indistinguishable from a minor scrape one might get from a shoe or a loose thread. But again, its precision, its isolation felt wrong. Two isolated, almost imperceptible marks. One a puncture, the other a minute linear abrasion. My internal alarm bells began to ring louder. This wasn't natural. Not with these subtle, almost surgical-like imperfections on an otherwise pristine body. This man hadn't just collapsed from a sudden heart attack. Something far more deliberate, far more insidious had transpired. And it was my job to peel back the layers until I found its truth. The external examination was complete, but the real work was just beginning. The trauma center cold room awaiting examination hummed with the steady thrum of ventilation, a cold, clinical counterpoint to the insistent demands of the living world outside. The emergency physician's words, heavy with the unspoken urgency of hospital operations, still echoed in my ears. The quicker we can get this wrapped up. I understood his position, the delicate balance of public perception and operational efficiency, but my obligation lay with the deceased. Expediency had no place in the pursuit of truth. I stood before the stainless steel table, the body of the deceased under a sterile sheet. The air, crisp and carrying the faint scent of disinfectant, seemed to sharpen my focus. My tools, laid out with surgical precision on a nearby tray, gleamed under the overhead lights. Scalpels, rib shears, forceps, bone saw, each instrument a promise of clarity and extension of my intent. "All right," I murmured to myself, pulling on a fresh pair of gloves, the latex snapping against my wrists. "Let's see what story you have to tell." I began the external examination again, a final, meticulous sweep for anything missed, anything superficial that might offer a hint. Nothing. No petechiae, no subtle bruising, no injection sites beyond the expected medical interventions. The skin, though pallid, was unremarkable. The eyes, cloudy with post-mortem changes, held no secrets. This clean slate only deepened the mystery, confirming my initial assessment that the cause, if unnatural, was deeply hidden. With a practiced hand, I made the primary Y incision, the scalpel gliding cleanly through the skin, fat and muscle. The underlying tissues parted, revealing the chest cavity. The initial site was superficially normal, ribs intact, no obvious fractures or external trauma to the sternum. I used the rib shears, the metallic snip cutting through bone with a dull crunch, exposing the internal landscape. The sternum lifted away and I peered into the thoracic cavity. My gaze swept across the lungs, their surfaces smooth and pinkish gray. No signs of massive hemorrhage or obvious pulmonary edema. The pericardial sac encasing the heart looked unremarkable. I carefully opened it. The heart itself, of normal size and configuration, appeared healthy, its coronary arteries clear of significant atherosclerosis. No immediate signs of myocardial infarction, no valvular abnormalities. My initial sense of unease, however, began to intensify. Something felt too perfect, given the abruptness of death. I systematically removed the organs, weighing and examining each one. The liver, typically a uniform, rich mahogany, had a subtle, almost iridescent sheen in places, a faint, mottled pattern beneath its smooth capsule. It was not a color I associated with a healthy organ, nor with typical post-mortem changes. It was too widespread, too uniform in its inconsistency. I palpated it. The texture felt subtly different, firmer in some areas, almost granular. Moving to the gastrointestinal tract, I opened the stomach. The gastric mucosa displayed an angry, diffuse erythema, far more pronounced than one would expect from mere post-mortem congestion. The lining was swollen, almost velvety, with a scattering of pinpoint erosions. This was not a natural progression. This was an acute insult, a violent reaction. My mind immediately raced through possibilities, corrosive agents, potent irritants, but without a clear identification of the substance. It was just a hypothesis. I continued meticulously dissecting, my gloved fingers probing, my eyes scanning for any deviation. The kidneys showed a similar, though less dramatic, discoloration, a pallor interspersed with areas of deeper, almost purplish hue. The adrenal glands, often indicators of stress, were slightly enlarged. This wasn't a vague illness. This wasn't a sudden, natural cardiac event. These were systemic changes, subtle yet undeniable, speaking of a body under siege from within. I took multiple tissue samples from each affected organ, carefully labeling them for histology and toxicology. The anomalies weren't screaming poison, but they were definitely whispering something foreign, something toxic. The precise agent remained elusive, a ghost in the cellular machinery, but the evidence of its passage was mounting. A profound sense of determination settled over me. The emergency physician's desire for quick resolution, the hospital administration's likely push for minimal disruption, all of it faded into background noise. I had found the internal world's protest, a silent scream of cellular distress. This was no natural death. This was foul play, cleverly concealed, designed to mimic the innocuous. "You didn't just die," I murmured, my voice barely a whisper in the cold room. "Someone made you die, and I'm going to find out how." The investigation had just shifted from a search for a cause to a hunt for a method, a perpetrator, and a story far more insidious than anyone in this bustling trauma center could possibly imagine. The mystery had deepened, but so had my resolve. The eyes, cloudy with the early stages of corneal desiccation, offered no secrets. I sighed, the sound swallowed by the sterile quiet of the trauma center cold room awaiting examination. My frustration, a dull ache beneath my ribs, sharpened. This body, a man in his late 30s, outwardly robust, presented an enigma. No trauma, no obvious disease, yet undeniably deceased. I stepped back, allowing my gaze to sweep over the body one last time, a mental checklist ticking off every inch. The lack of external clues was itself a clue, pointing inward, demanding a deeper probe. "Right," I muttered, the word hanging in the chilled air. "Time to go digging." My scalpel, a gleaming extension of my will, made the initial Y incision with practiced precision. The skin parted smoothly, revealing subcutaneous fat, pale yellow and unremarkable. My methodical dissection proceeded, organ by organ. The heart, firm and of normal size, showed no signs of infarction or valvular disease. The lungs, pink and crepitant, were free of congestion or embolism. Liver, kidneys, spleen all appeared macroscopically normal. It was a symphony of normalcy, a discordant note in the face of death. I carefully harvested tissue samples, placing them into labeled cassettes, sections of myocardium, brainstem, liver, kidney, lung, and muscle. These would be my next frontier. I also drew samples for a preliminary toxicology screen. The clock was ticking, not just on the case, but on the mounting pressure from the hospital administration and the detective who would inevitably call. The hum of the ventilation system was a familiar companion. I prepared the tissue samples for microscopy, embedding them, slicing them with the microtome into impossibly thin sections, then staining them with hematoxylin and eosin. Each slide was a tiny window into the cellular architecture of a life abruptly ended. Under the powerful magnification of the microscope, I began my meticulous survey. Slide after slide, I searched for the subtle deviations, the microscopic signatures of disease or injury that the naked eye had missed. The myocardial cells, typically striated and organized, showed no signs of necrosis or inflammation. The brain tissue, usually a delicate tapestry of neurons and glial cells, appeared structurally intact. My brow furrowed deeper with each negative finding. This was beyond baffling. It was almost an affront to my experience. Then, on a section of the liver, something caught my eye. A faint, shimmering deposit, almost crystalline in nature, scattered within the hepatocytes. It wasn't cellular debris, nor was it a typical pigment. It had an unnatural, geometric quality to it, reflecting the light in an unusual way. I adjusted the focus, zooming in further. The structures were minute, almost imperceptible, yet distinctly foreign. They weren't organic in origin, at least not in any biological sense I recognized. They looked synthetic. I toggled to the polarizing filter. The deposits, previously faint, now glowed with a striking birefringence, confirming their crystalline structure. My heart gave a strange lurch. This was it. This was the anomaly. These weren't calcium oxalates or drug crystals I was familiar with. Their morphology was too uniform, too precise. Simultaneously, the preliminary toxicology screen results blinked onto my monitor. Standard panels for common drugs of abuse, alcohol, and routine pharmaceuticals were all negative. But one specific advanced panel, which I had run out of a hunch for something truly unusual, flagged a hit. A trace amount of an industrial polymer, one typically found in advanced manufacturing, not in human biology. The name on the screen was unfamiliar, complex, and utterly out of place. I cross-referenced the polymer's known properties with the appearance of the crystals under the microscope. The descriptions matched. A highly stable, inert microscopic particulate designed for extreme durability and resistance to degradation. It was a digital footprint, not of data, but of engineered matter left behind in the very cells of the liver. This wasn't a natural death, nor a simple poisoning. This was something engineered, something precise and insidious. How did such a substance enter the body? And more importantly, how did it kill? It was present in such minute quantities, yet it was the only abnormality. My hand instinctively reached for the phone. I needed to bring in external expertise. This wasn't just a medical mystery. It was verging into the realm of the deliberately clandestine. I dialed the number for the lead detective on the case, the one who'd called me in. "Detective," I began, my voice tight with a mixture of discovery and profound unease. "It's Dean. I have something. It's not what we expected, not even close." I paused, gathering my thoughts. The image of those glowing, foreign crystals burned into my mind. We're looking at something microscopic, something synthetic, a polymer of all things. It's baffling, and frankly, I need you to understand how unprecedented this is. The line was silent for a moment. Then I heard the detective's sharp intake of breath. The heart, firm and of normal size, showed no signs of infarction, its coronary arteries clear. I moved to the lungs, their pink, spongy tissue filling my gloved hands. No consolidation, no emboli, no signs of aspiration or edema. The liver, a dark, glistening mass, appeared healthy, its capsule smooth, its parenchyma uniform. The kidneys, adrenal glands, pancreas, and spleen followed, each meticulously examined, weighed, and sampled, all yielding the same confounding normalcy. The entire abdominal cavity, devoid of hemorrhage or mass, offered no answers. The silence in the trauma center cold room awaiting examination was broken only by the hum of the ventilation system and the soft rustle of my gown. This lack of gross pathology was increasingly unsettling. A seemingly healthy individual, found dead, with nothing to explain it on initial inspection, always raised my hackles. It meant the cause was subtle, insidious, or deliberately obscured. My mind sifted through possibilities: an undetectable arrhythmia, a rapid-acting poison, an acute metabolic crisis that left no structural footprint. But the scene, the context, a busy hospital, not some isolated wilderness, kept nudging at me. I turned my attention to the head. With a practiced hand, I used the oscillating saw, its high-pitched whine briefly piercing the quiet. The skull cap lifted away, revealing the dura mater, glistening and intact. Beneath it, the brain, pale and convoluted, filled the cranial vault. I carefully extracted it, placing it on the stainless steel examination tray. The cerebral hemispheres appeared symmetrical, the gyri and sulci within normal limits. No obvious contusions, no hemorrhages, no signs of stroke or tumor. I began my standard sectioning, each slice revealing healthy white and gray matter. The cerebellum, the brainstem, all pristine. This body was a perfect specimen of health, yet it lay before me, irrevocably deceased. I leaned closer, adjusting the overhead lamp, its focused beam illuminating the delicate structures of the brainstem. I traced the cranial nerves, meticulously examining the pons and medulla oblongata. It was there, just superior to the obex, a minuscule disruption. Not a bleed, not a tear, but a patch of tissue, no larger than a pinhead, where the normal, uniform texture seemed subtly altered. It was almost imperceptible, a slight dulling of the usual sheen, a fractional deviation in color. If I hadn't been looking for anything out of place, I would have missed it. I retrieved my dissecting microscope, an instrument usually reserved for minute tissue examination, and brought it to bear. Under magnification, the anomaly became clearer. It wasn't necrosis, not exactly. It was more like a highly localized, almost surgical depletion of glial cells, leaving behind a delicate network of intact but strangely denuded neurons. It was too precise, too focal to be a natural process. It spoke of an incredibly targeted insult. My breath hitched. This wasn't the signature of a random event, nor a crude act of violence. This was the work of someone with an intimate, specialized knowledge of neuroanatomy and neurophysiology, someone who knew exactly where to strike with what agent to achieve a rapid, untraceable cessation of vital functions without leaving a messy trail. This wasn't an accident. This was an execution, carried out with a terrifying degree of medical sophistication. The implications hit me like a physical blow. To cause such a precise, localized insult in such a critical area without leaving any external mark or widespread internal damage would require either an incredibly potent and specific neurotoxin delivered with pinpoint accuracy or a highly skilled, almost surgical, manipulation of these delicate structures. Either way, it pointed to a perpetrator with advanced medical training or access to specialized hospital resources. The very place the victim died, the trauma center, was now staring back at me, not as a backdrop, but as a potential scene of a crime, and perhaps the source of the method. A knock on the door startled me, pulling me away from the microscope. I straightened, removing my gloves. "Dean, do you have anything for us yet?" The voice belonged to a hospital administrator, a man in a crisp suit, his expression a careful blend of professional concern and thinly veiled impatience. Beside him, a legal counsel, equally buttoned up, stood with a neutral but watchful gaze. "I'm still in the process of examination," I replied, my voice steady despite the adrenaline now coursing through me. I didn't elaborate on my discovery, not yet. The evidence needed to be documented, confirmed. "We understand that these things take time," the administrator continued, his tone smooth but insistent. "However, the optics of an unexplained death in our facility, especially one involving an otherwise healthy individual, are challenging. We're getting inquiries. The family is understandably distressed. A preliminary report would go a long way in calming things down." "My report will be thorough, not rushed," I stated, meeting his gaze. "Preliminary findings often lead to premature conclusions. I need to be certain." The legal counsel stepped forward slightly. "We appreciate your dedication, doctor, but any suggestion of foul play, particularly within hospital grounds, could have significant ramifications. It would be in everyone's best interest to rule out natural causes quickly if possible." "I am investigating the cause of death," I reiterated, my voice firm, "and I follow the evidence wherever it leads. What I'm seeing so far doesn't fit a simple natural causes narrative. In fact, it's quite the opposite." I let the implication hang in the air, watching their faces tighten. The administrator's jaw clenched almost imperceptibly. "Are you suggesting something else?" The administrator pressed, his voice lower, laced with a new edge of apprehension. "I'm suggesting a level of precision that requires specific knowledge and tools," I said, gesturing vaguely towards the body without revealing specifics. "This isn't an open and shut case, gentlemen. It's becoming increasingly complex." Their expressions shifted from impatience to genuine concern, bordering on alarm. They exchanged a quick, worried glance. The administrator cleared his throat. "Keep us informed, Dean. Immediately, every detail." His tone was no longer merely impatient. It was laced with a demand for control, for information that could be managed. The air felt heavier now, charged with unspoken anxieties. The trauma center, designed to save lives, now harbored the ghost of a death that was anything but natural. I looked back at the brain, the tiny, almost invisible lesion, a stark testament to a calculated malice. This was no longer just about how someone died. It was about who had the means, the knowledge, and the audacity to do it here. And that, I knew, was a far more dangerous question. The administrator's words, heavy with thinly veiled threats and a demand for absolute control, echoed in my ears as I left the trauma center cold room awaiting examination. My lab coat felt tighter, the air suddenly charged with an unspoken urgency that had nothing to do with the deceased on the gurney. They wanted answers, fast and clean. I knew with an unsettling certainty that the answers I was about to uncover would be neither. The corridors hummed with the usual frantic energy of a major hospital, but I moved through it in a bubble of focused thought. The initial examination had confirmed my suspicions. No external trauma, no obvious signs of struggle, no readily apparent cause of death. Yet the subtle neurological presentation, the almost too pristine internal organs, it all screamed manipulation. This wasn't a simple cardiac arrest. This wasn't an aneurysm. This was something engineered. I bypassed my usual post-mortem prep area, heading directly to my office, a sanctuary crammed with textbooks, medical journals, and the glowing screens of my workstations. The door clicked shut behind me, muting the hospital's cacophony. I stripped off my gloves, the faint scent of antiseptic clinging to my skin, and sat down before my main monitor. "All right, John Doe," I muttered to the empty room. "Let's see who you really were and what brought you here." My fingers flew across the keyboard, opening multiple windows. I started with a broad sweep. Sudden unexplained death, adults, no obvious pathology. The initial results were a deluge of statistics, mostly natural causes, some undiagnosed genetic conditions, a few drug overdoses. None of it fit the meticulous absence of evidence I had observed. The patient was healthy. Too healthy to simply drop dead like that. I narrowed my search. I focused on physiological collapse, specific organ system failure without preceding disease. My mind replayed the subtle rigidity I'd felt, the peculiar pallor, the almost imperceptible tremor in his extremities during the brief observation. Was it neurological, cardiovascular, or something that mimicked both? I delved into obscure medical journals, academic papers on rare toxins, and experimental physiological manipulations. My keywords became more specific, more speculative. Undetectable neurotoxin, rapidly metabolized poison, non-invasive cardiac arrest induction, subtle physiological disruption. Hours blurred. The fluorescent lights hummed, casting a sterile glow on the stacks of reference books. My coffee grew cold. The breakthroughs were incremental, then suddenly, a cascade. First, a series of research papers from a decade ago, detailing theoretical methods of inducing specific neurological and cardiac events using highly targeted, non-invasive energy pulses. The technology was nascent then, dismissed as impractical, too complex and expensive for any real-world application. Then, a rabbit hole into a lesser-known medical device registry, not for commercially available products, but for experimental prototypes. I found a reference to a neuromodulatory inducer, a device designed for highly localized, short-duration stimulation of nerve clusters, supposedly for pain management. The listed manufacturer was a small, almost anonymous bioengineering firm that had dissolved 5 years prior. The device itself was described as portable, handheld, and designed for minimal physical contact, delivering a focused electromagnetic pulse. The critical detail: its potential for off-label use to induce specific acute physiological responses, including cardiac arrhythmia and respiratory arrest, if applied incorrectly or with malicious intent. The literature stressed the near impossibility of detecting its application post-mortem due to the lack of physical trace. My breath hitched. This wasn't a poison or a surgical manipulation. This was a device, a silent, invisible weapon. The implications hit me with the force of a physical blow. If this device existed, and if it could induce such a clean, undetectable death, then John Doe was unlikely to be the first. My search shifted from the how to the who else. I cross-referenced my findings with databases of unexplained deaths, particularly those initially attributed to sudden cardiac event or natural causes in otherwise healthy individuals, focusing on a time frame spanning the last 5 years, roughly when such experimental devices might have matured beyond theoretical models. I filtered by age range, geographical location, and crucially, by the lack of any definitive pathological findings. A pattern began to emerge. Not a neat, obvious cluster, but a constellation of isolated incidents, scattered across different cities, different hospitals, all with the same maddeningly vague cause of death. A 40-year-old lawyer in Seattle, a 35-year-old engineer in Boston, a 42-year-old journalist in Denver. All seemingly healthy, all sudden inexplicable deaths. All initially deemed natural, dismissed as tragic anomalies. The data points were too numerous to ignore, too specific in their ambiguity. The details were sparse in the public records. No autopsy reports typically contained enough information to detect this kind of physiological manipulation without a specific reason to look for it. But the absence of evidence, combined with the presence of healthy victims, spoke volumes. I leaned back, my chair creaking under the sudden shift. The tension in my shoulders had solidified into a painful knot. This wasn't just a medical mystery anymore. It was a series of premeditated acts. Someone had found a way to kill silently, invisibly, leaving no trace. And they had done it before. My gaze drifted to the clock on the wall. The night was bleeding into the early hours of morning. My initial plan for a thorough autopsy had just been completely rewritten. I needed to re-examine John Doe, not just for what he showed, but for what he didn't. And I needed to do it with a new understanding of the invisible hand that might have ended his life. The administrator's demand for control suddenly seemed insignificant. I was about to expose something far larger, far more sinister than a simple medical anomaly. My monitor's glare burned against the lingering fatigue in my eyes, but the puzzle was finally coalescing. Hours of digging through medical literature, cross-referencing rare conditions and unusual toxins, had yielded a terrifyingly elegant solution. The subtle, almost imperceptible cellular changes I'd noted in the myocardial tissue, a peculiar vacuolization, a faint disruption of the sarcoplasmic reticulum, were not random. They pointed to a highly specific metabolic interference, a cellular energy shutdown, not unlike a severe, acute mitochondrial poisoning. My fingers flew across the keyboard, opening multiple windows. None of it fit the microscopic evidence. I had to pivot to think beyond the conventional. The victim's rapid collapse, the lack of struggle, the pristine scene all suggested something swift, potent, and administered without overt physical trauma. What could cause a complete system failure without leaving a clear chemical signature for routine toxicology? I filtered my search, adding terms like rapid onset cardiac arrest, undetectable toxins, cellular respiration inhibitors. A few obscure compounds surfaced, mostly experimental, some with limited clinical application. One in particular caught my attention, a synthetic derivative of a plant-derived neurotoxin, modified for research into specific neurological pathways. It was designed to be incredibly potent, fast-acting, and critically, rapidly metabolized into inert compounds, making it nearly impossible to detect in standard post-mortem screens without specific targeted assays. Its mechanism aligned perfectly with the microscopic changes I'd observed. My gaze drifted from the screen to the cold, sterile environment of the trauma center cold room awaiting examination. The victim lay beneath a white sheet, a silent testament to a cunning killer. This was precision. Who in this hospital would have access to such a specialized compound? Who would possess the knowledge to administer it effectively and evade detection? My mind immediately went to the research labs, the pharmacology department, perhaps even a highly specialized clinician with a research background. I pulled up the hospital's internal directory, cross-referencing names against departmental access logs. Dr. Aris Thorne, a senior anesthesiologist, had recently published several papers on novel pain management compounds, some of which explored similar molecular structures. More importantly, his access log showed frequent visits to the secure research pharmacology lab, even outside his regular clinical hours. A cold knot tightened in my stomach. A quick check of the victim's medical history showed no prior interaction with Dr. Thorne. But the victim had been a volunteer for a hospital-sponsored wellness program, a program Dr. Thorne had briefly advised on. A tenuous link, but a link nonetheless. The motive remained elusive, but the means and opportunity were sharpening into focus. I reviewed the security footage from the previous day, focusing on the corridors leading to the emergency department where the victim had been found. It was a chaotic environment, a blur of activity. But there, in a fleeting moment, I saw it. The victim, walking towards the waiting area, then a brief, almost imperceptible brush with a figure in surgical scrubs. The figure's face was obscured by a mask and cap, but the build, the gait, the slight hesitation before moving on, it was consistent with Doctor. A transdermal patch, perhaps, or a microneedle injection disguised as a bump. My hands trembled slightly as I picked up my phone. "Detective Miller," I stated, my voice steadier than I felt. "I have a lead, and I need a specific toxicology panel run immediately on the sample from our John Doe. I detailed the compound, the suspected mechanism. And I need you to bring Dr. Aris Thorne in for questioning, gently. We don't want to tip our hand." Minutes later, a colleague from the toxicology lab, a young resident named Doctor. My queue is backed up for days. "Trust me, Dr. Lee, this can't wait." I explained the situation, omitting the suspect's name for now, focusing on the scientific urgency. "This is a rapidly degrading compound. If we don't test for it now, we might miss it entirely. It's designed to be elusive." Dr. Lee's eyes widened as I described the compound's properties. "A mitochondrial uncoupler? That's bold and incredibly difficult to trace." He nodded, understanding the gravity. "I'll fast-track it, but it'll take a specialized team and a few hours to set up the assay." The waiting was excruciating. Every minute felt like an hour. My mind raced, piecing together fragments. The rapid onset of bradycardia, followed by complete asystole. It was all there, hidden in plain sight, masked by the seeming naturalness of the death. Finally, the phone rang. It was Dr. Lee. His voice was tight, professional. Dean, the preliminary results are back. We found trace amounts of the synthetic neurotoxin derivative in the victim's blood and tissue samples. Extremely low concentration, almost gone, but it's there. Consistent with rapid metabolism. It matches the profile I described. A wave of both grim satisfaction and profound sadness washed over me. The mechanism was confirmed. The precise, insidious method of death was no longer a mystery. A powerful, rapidly metabolized toxin, likely administered via a discrete transdermal patch or microinjection, designed to mimic natural cardiac arrest. The next step was to ensure justice. The sterile chill of the trauma center cold room awaiting examination clung to my skin, a familiar, almost comforting embrace. Before me on the gurney lay the deceased, now a canvas of meticulously gathered evidence. Around me the air crackled with a different kind of tension. The detective stood to my left, his gaze a mixture of skepticism and grim expectation. Across from him, the hospital's legal counsel, a sharp-suited woman, tapped a pen against a notepad, her expression unreadable. Beside her, the chief of staff, his face a mask of professional concern, shifted his weight. They were here for answers, and I was about to deliver them, unvarnished and unsettling. "Thank you for coming," I began, my voice steady, cutting through the silence. "We've moved beyond speculation. The initial autopsy, combined with expedited toxicology and advanced cellular pathology, has confirmed the mechanism of death." I gestured towards the body. The deceased did not succumb to natural causes, nor was this a simple case of medical malpractice or an undetected pre-existing condition exacerbated by stress. I paused, letting my words sink in. The detective's jaw tightened. The legal counsel stopped tapping her pen. "What we have here," I continued, picking up a laser pointer and indicating a specific, almost imperceptible discoloration on the deceased's forearm, "is a deliberate act, a sophisticated, targeted poisoning." I clicked the pointer onto a large monitor displaying magnified histological slides. "This, gentlemen and madam, is the entry point." The image showed a minute almost microscopic puncture wound, surrounded by a faint, localized tissue reaction. A micro-injection site, barely visible to the naked eye, designed to be missed in the chaos of an emergency admission, especially given the rapid onset of symptoms mimicking cardiac arrest. My gaze swept over their faces, registering their growing discomfort. The toxin itself is ingenious, a synthetic compound engineered for rapid systemic distribution and even more rapid metabolic degradation. It attacks the mitochondrial function at a cellular level, effectively suffocating the cells from within, leading to a cascade of organ failure that presents exactly like a massive myocardial infarction or a sudden, severe stroke. I clicked to another slide, displaying complex protein structures. Our lab was able to isolate trace metabolites, specifically a unique enzymatic byproduct that doesn't occur naturally in the human body. This, combined with the precise cellular damage patterns we observed in the heart muscle and brain tissue patterns inconsistent with typical ischemic injury, but perfectly aligned with mitochondrial dysfunction, gave us the definitive answer. "Undetectable," the chief of staff finally spoke, his voice strained. "How could something so lethal be so quickly metabolized?" "That's the brilliance and the horror of it," I explained, meeting his gaze. "Within hours, sometimes minutes, the active compound is virtually gone, leaving behind only the metabolic debris we painstakingly identified. The perpetrator banked on this, and on the high-stress environment of a trauma center where rapid, often presumptive diagnoses are made under immense pressure. They expected a death certificate listing cardiac arrest or unknown etiology, and for the body to be quickly released." I moved closer to the gurney, my voice dropping slightly, emphasizing the gravity of my next words. "But we found something else. Something that ties this directly to an individual within this institution." The legal counsel's face paled. The detective leaned forward, his eyes narrowed. "Dr. Elias Thorne," I stated, the name hanging heavy in the air. "His research, specifically on novel cellular energy modulators, aligns precisely with the properties of this compound. We found preliminary drafts of his research papers on an unsecured server, detailing the compound's ability to induce rapid cellular apoptosis and its rapid degradation profile. He was attempting to prove a theory, a radical hypothesis about controlled cellular shutdown for specific therapeutic applications. But he wasn't just theorizing. I clicked the pointer to a final slide, showing a timeline. Our investigation revealed that the deceased was a participant in an experimental trial, supervised by Dr. Thorne for an unrelated condition. A trial that, according to the official records, concluded weeks ago. However, Internal hospital logs show Dr. Thorne accessed the deceased's medical records just hours before their death. More critically, we found a discrepancy in the inventory of a specialized micro-injector device, one specifically designed for highly localized drug delivery, signed out under Dr. Thorne's name on the day of the incident, and returned with a missing single-use needle cartridge. The motive, I continued, the word tasting bitter on my tongue, appears to be a grotesque perversion of scientific ambition. Dr. Thorne wasn't just researching a compound. He was testing its ultimate efficacy, its ability to induce a natural death, leaving no trace within a controlled environment. The legal counsel was furiously scribbling notes, her face a mask of shock and dismay. The detective stared at the deceased, then back at me, a profound understanding dawning in his eyes. The unveiling was complete. The truth, cold and sharp as the chill seeping from the steel table beneath the deceased, had been laid bare. The chief of staff, his face a roadmap of collapsing authority, sagged against the wall. The legal counsel, her pen paused mid-stroke, stared at the body with a horrified understanding that transcended mere legal implications. The detective, his gaze shifting between the victim and me, absorbed the gravity of my findings, his expression hardening into professional resolve. It wasn't an accident, I stated, my voice cutting through the suffocating silence of the trauma center cold room awaiting examination. I gestured back to the deceased, whose stillness now seemed less peaceful, more violated. The initial presentation, the lack of external trauma, the seemingly healthy state, it was all a carefully constructed facade. The victim didn't simply succumb to an unknown internal event. They were systematically shut down. I picked up the toxicology report from my tray, the paper crinkling softly. The initial screen, as expected, showed nothing remarkable, but I pushed for an expanded panel, focusing on substances that could mimic cardiac arrest or neurological collapse, substances that might be overlooked in a rapid emergency setting, especially when administered in precise, sublethal doses over time. I let the words hang, watching the faces in the room. We found it. A highly potent, fast-acting neuromuscular blocking agent, not enough to paralyze instantly, but enough, when combined with a pre-existing, though mild, cardiac vulnerability, to precipitate a fatal event in a high-stress environment. The chief of staff pushed himself off the wall, his eyes wide. A paralytic administered? How? Precisely, I affirmed, my gaze meeting his. This isn't something you'd find in a patient's regular medication regimen. It's a drug with very specific hospital applications, tightly controlled. It was administered intravenously, likely in small, repeated doses over a short period, culminating in the final lethal push. The subtle track marks, almost imperceptible on the inner arm, were disguised as routine Roman foresights. I paused, letting the implication sink in. Someone with intimate knowledge of hospital protocols, drug access, and the victim's medical history. Someone who could move through this facility without drawing suspicion. My eyes swept over the grim faces, then settled on the chief of staff. The victim, as you know, was a long-term patient here, recovering from a minor procedure. They were considered stable, and yet their condition inexplicably deteriorated. We found evidence of a subtle electrolyte imbalance, deliberately induced, which would have made them uniquely susceptible to the paralytic's effects. A perfect storm manufactured. The detective stepped forward, his voice low and dangerous. You're saying this was a deliberate act by someone inside the hospital? I am. I confirmed, the weight of the accusation heavy on my tongue. The timing, the method, the specific drug, it all points to a calculated act. And the only individual with the consistent access, the medical expertise to orchestrate such a subtle yet deadly sequence. And the motive we've been uncovering through the victim's financial records and legal entanglements is clear. I turned to face the chief of staff directly. The primary attending physician on this case, the one who signed off on every shift, every medication, every seemingly innocuous change in the victim's care plan, was Dr. Elias Thorne. A collective gasp rippled through the room. The chief of staff stumbled back, hitting the wall again with a dull thud. The legal counsel dropped her pen, the clatter echoing unnaturally loud. Thorne, a respected figure within the hospital, a pillar of the medical community, was the last person anyone would suspect. Dr. Thorne, I reiterated, my voice firm despite the rising tension. His financial records show significant undeclared debts. The victim, it turns out, was a key witness in a malpractice suit against him from a previous, similarly ambiguous patient death. A death that was, at the time, attributed to natural causes, but which, in retrospect, bears striking similarities to this one. The detective immediately pulled out his radio, his gaze fixed on the chief of staff. "Get me a team. Dr. Elias Thorne. Do not let him leave the premises. Secure his office, his patient records, everything." The chief of staff, pale and trembling, could only nod, his authority shattered. The legal counsel, recovering her composure, began issuing urgent instructions into her phone, undoubtedly alerting security and preparing for the inevitable legal fallout. I watched the unfolding chaos, a grim satisfaction warring with a profound sense of sorrow. My role was done here, the truth excavated from beneath layers of medical obfuscation and human deceit. The immediate tension in the room began to dissipate, replaced by a different kind of pressure, the administrative and legal storm that would now engulf the institution. The deceased lay still, their secrets no longer their own. This case, like so many others, underscored the intricate, often terrifying balance between healing and harm within the medical world. A place designed for life had become an instrument of death, its very systems exploited. Trust had been shattered not just for the victims, but for every patient, every colleague, every family member who believed in the sanctity of medical care. My work was often grim, but it was essential. It was the unwavering pursuit of truth, a crucial, often thankless task in a world where hidden motives could turn life-saving knowledge into a deadly weapon.